August 16, 1969. While Richie Havens sang "Freedom" to 500,000 souls gathered in the muddy fields of Bethel, New York, a painfully shy 22-year-old photographer named Daniel Miller crouched behind his camera lens, using his Nikon as a shield between himself and the overwhelming chaos of humanity surrounding him. Daniel had come to Woodstock not to experience the music festival, but to document it for a small underground magazine that paid him $25 per published photo. He was the kind of person who observed life rather than lived it, who felt more comfortable behind a viewfinder than face-to-face with another human being. What Daniel didn't know was that in less than an hour, he would witness the most beautiful and uninhibited moment of his young life, a moment that would haunt his dreams and change his understanding of what it meant to be truly free. Her name was Starlight, and she danced naked in the rain as if the entire universe was watching, which, in Daniel's case, it absolutely was. Daniel had always been the invisible boy. In high school, he was the kid who ate lunch alone, who developed photographs in the darkroom during recess, who spoke only when directly addressed by teachers. His mother worried constantly about his social isolation. His father dismissed him as too sensitive for his own good, and his classmates simply forgot he existed. Photography had become his refuge, his way of engaging with the world without having to risk the vulnerability of actual human connection. Through his camera lens, Daniel could observe beauty, capture emotion, and tell stories without ever having to reveal anything about himself. The camera was his protection, his excuse to be present without being noticed, his method of touching life without being touched by it. But photography had also become his prison, keeping him safely removed from the very experiences he spent his time documenting. The assignment to cover Woodstock had terrified Daniel almost as much as it excited him. Rolling Stone and Life magazine had sent their top photographers to capture the historic festival, while Daniel represented a tiny countercultural publication called Underground Voices that barely had enough budget to cover his travel expenses. He felt completely out of his league among the confident, established photographers who moved through the crowd with professional ease, their expensive equipment marking them as serious artists. Daniel's modest gear and uncertain demeanor made him feel like an imposter, a scared kid pretending to be a real photographer. But his editor had believed in him enough to send him to the most important cultural event of the decade, and Daniel was determined not to waste the opportunity, even if his hands shook every time he had to ask someone's permission to photograph them. The festival grounds were unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced. The sheer number of people overwhelmed his senses, bodies everywhere, music echoing from multiple stages, the constant hum of conversation, laughter, and singing. The air was thick with the scent of marijuana, incense, unwashed bodies, and rain-soaked earth. Daniel had grown up in a quiet suburban household where emotions were rarely expressed and physical affection was uncomfortable territory. Here, people hugged strangers, shared food with anyone who looked hungry, and expressed themselves with a freedom that both fascinated and terrified him. Through his camera lens, Daniel began to capture the festival's essence. The muddy feet dancing to Santana's guitar, the flower crowns adorning sun-kissed faces, the peace signs painted on bare chests, the couples making love in sleeping bags without shame or self-consciousness. As the afternoon sun began to break through the clouds after a morning of intermittent rain, Daniel found himself positioned near the main stage, searching for the perfect shot that would capture the spirit of Woodstock. The crowd was energized by Country Joe McDonald's anti-war anthem, and people were dancing with increasing abandon as the music swelled around them. Daniel was adjusting his camera settings when movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A young woman was making her way through the crowd, not pushing or forcing her passage, but flowing like water around the obstacles of bodies and blankets. She had long, flowing hair the color of honey, adorned with wildflowers and small braids that caught the afternoon light. Her face was painted with intricate designs in blues and greens that seemed to echo the earth and sky, and she wore flowing scarves and jewelry that created music with every step. But it was her eyes that stopped Daniel in his tracks, eyes that seemed to hold infinite depth, infinite joy, infinite freedom. The woman, who Daniel would later learn called herself Starlight, seemed to be dancing to music that existed beyond what the band was playing, as if she heard rhythms that connected her directly to the heartbeat of the universe. She moved with a grace that was both earthly and ethereal, her body expressing emotions that Daniel had never learned to feel, let alone express. As the music reached a crescendo, something magical happened. Starlight began to remove her clothing, not with the calculated seduction of a stripper, but with the natural unself-consciousness of someone returning to her most authentic state. The scarves fell away like autumn leaves, revealing a body that was beautiful, not because it conformed to any conventional standard, but because it was inhabited by someone completely comfortable in her own skin. Before you continue this incredible journey with us, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of love, transformation, and the moments that change everything. Daniel's camera seemed to rise to his eye of its own accord. Through his viewfinder, he watched as Starlight danced naked in the rain that had begun to fall again, her arms raised to the sky as if embracing the storm itself. Water streamed down her painted face, washing the designs into rivers of blue and green that flowed over her skin like living art. Other festival-goers gathered in a circle around her, not to gawk or objectify, but to witness something sacred. This wasn't nudity for shock value or attention. This was a human being expressing pure, unfiltered joy and freedom. Daniel found himself crying behind his camera, tears mixing with the rain on his face as he captured frame after frame of the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to witness true authenticity, true fearlessness, true connection with the divine feminine energy that Starlight embodied. The dance lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours to Daniel. When Starlight finally opened her eyes and lowered her arms, she seemed to notice the crowd that had gathered around her for the first time. Instead of shame or embarrassment, her face showed only gentle amusement and gratitude. She bowed slightly to her impromptu audience, gathered her discarded clothing, and began to dress with the same unself-conscious grace with which she had undressed. Daniel continued photographing, capturing the way she interacted with the people around her, accepting hugs, sharing smiles, radiating a warmth that seemed to touch everyone in her vicinity. He was so absorbed in documenting her that he didn't notice when she began walking directly toward him, her painted eyes fixed on his camera lens with curious intensity. "You've been watching me through that magic box," Starlight said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent that made even the simple words sound like poetry. "But I'd like to see the eyes behind the lens." Daniel felt his face flush with embarrassment and panic. He had been discovered, exposed, caught in the act of voyeurism that his profession had taught him to disguise as art. His usual response would have been to mumble an apology and disappear into the crowd, but something about Starlight's gentle tone and genuine curiosity kept him frozen in place. "I'm sorry," he stammered, lowering his camera for the first time all day. "I'm a photographer. I was documenting the festival. I didn't mean to intrude on your moment." Starlight laughed, a sound like wind chimes mixed with birdsong. "Honey, you weren't intruding. You were bearing witness." "There's a difference." She stepped closer, and Daniel caught the scent of patchouli oil and rain-washed skin. "What's your name? Photographer man?" "Daniel," he managed to say, surprised that his voice worked at all. "Daniel Miller." Starlight extended her hand, her fingers still slightly damp from the rain. "I'm Starlight. Well, that's what I call myself these days. My mama named me Susan, but that girl feels like someone I used to be in another lifetime." When Daniel took her hand, he felt an electric shock that had nothing to do with the storm clouds overhead. Her touch was warm, firm, completely present, the handshake of someone who existed fully in her body, fully in the moment. "It's nice to meet you, Daniel Miller. I'd love to see the pictures you took of my dance. Would you be willing to share them with me?" Daniel nodded mutely, still struggling to process that this radiant, fearless woman was actually talking to him, actually interested in seeing his work. "I don't have a way to develop them here," he said, finding his voice again. "But I could send you prints when I get back to the city." Starlight's smile widened, transforming her painted face into something that belonged in Renaissance art depicting angels. "Oh, honey, I'm not going back to any city anytime soon. I'm living in the moment, following the music wherever it takes me. But if you want to share those pictures with me, you're going to have to stick around long enough to show me in person." The suggestion hung in the air between them, like an invitation to a completely different kind of life. Daniel had a job to return to, an apartment lease, a dark room full of equipment, a carefully structured existence that left no room for spontaneous adventures with naked dancing hippie girls. Everything rational about his personality screamed at him to politely decline, exchange contact information, and retreat to the safety of his observer role. But as he looked into Starlight's eyes, Daniel realized that he was tired of being safe, tired of watching life happen to other people while he documented it from a distance. For the first time in his 22 years, Daniel Miller was being invited to stop observing and start living. Daniel's decision to stay at Woodstock beyond his original assignment deadline felt like jumping off a cliff into unknown territory. He had never made an impulsive choice in his adult life, never deviated from carefully laid plans, never allowed emotion to override logic. But something about Starlight's invitation had awakened a part of him that had been dormant since childhood, the part that craved adventure, connection, and authentic experience. After sending a telegram to his editor explaining that he was following an important story and would file his photos later than planned, Daniel found himself walking through the festival grounds beside this extraordinary woman who seemed to collect friends and experiences the way he collected photographs. Starlight introduced him to her traveling companions, a group of artists, musicians, and free spirits who lived in converted school buses and followed music festivals across the country like modern-day gypsies. The contrast between Daniel's background and Starlight's lifestyle couldn't have been more dramatic. While he had grown up in a sterile suburban environment where emotional expression was discouraged and physical affection was rare, Starlight had been raised in a bohemian household in New Orleans, where art, music, and sensuality were celebrated as sacred aspects of human experience. Her mother was a jazz singer who had performed in the French Quarter, her father, a poet who had introduced her to Eastern philosophy and meditation before she was old enough to fully understand the concepts. "I was born into freedom," Starlight explained as they sat sharing a joint with her friends around a campfire that evening. "But you, sweet Daniel, you're choosing freedom for the first time. That makes your journey even more beautiful than mine." Her words touched something deep in Daniel's chest, a recognition that he had been living in a prison of his own making. As the evening progressed, Daniel found himself opening up in ways that surprised him. The combination of marijuana, Starlight's non-judgmental presence, and the general atmosphere of acceptance that permeated the festival grounds created a space where his usual social anxiety began to dissolve. He told stories about his childhood, about feeling invisible in his own family, about discovering photography as a way to connect with the world without risking rejection. Starlight listened with the kind of attention that made him feel truly heard for the first time in his life. "You know what I think?" she said, her eyes reflecting the firelight as she spoke. "I think you've been using that camera like a shield, protecting yourself from experiencing life directly. But life isn't meant to be experienced through a lens. It's meant to be felt in your skin, tasted on your tongue, breathed into your lungs until it becomes part of who you are." The second day of the festival brought clearer skies and even more intense music. Crosby, Stills, and Nash took the stage, followed by The Who, and the energy of the crowd seemed to build with each performance. Daniel found himself photographing less and experiencing more, drawn into the rhythm of festival life by Starlight's infectious enthusiasm. She taught him to dance without worrying about how he looked, to sing along with songs he didn't know, to accept food and joints from strangers without questioning their motives. "The hippie way," she explained, "is about trusting in the basic goodness of people until they prove otherwise. Most folks never prove otherwise if you approach them with love instead of fear." Daniel had spent his entire life approaching the world with fear, and discovering the alternative felt like learning to breathe underwater. That afternoon, while Jimi Hendrix was performing his legendary set, Starlight took Daniel's hand and led him away from the main stage toward a quieter area where small groups of people were engaged in more intimate conversations and activities. "I want to show you something," she said, guiding him to a grove of trees where several couples were making love on blankets spread across the soft earth. Daniel's first instinct was to look away, his Midwestern upbringing flooding him with shame and embarrassment. But Starlight gently turned his face back toward the scene. "Look at them, Daniel. Really look. This isn't pornography or perversion. This is love being expressed in its most natural form. This is what happens when people aren't afraid of their own bodies, their own desires, their own capacity for pleasure." Daniel tried to see the scene through her eyes, and gradually his shock gave way to something approaching wonder. These weren't crude or animalistic encounters. They were tender, passionate, deeply connected expressions of human intimacy. "The whole world has taught us to be ashamed of our bodies," Starlight continued, her voice soft but intense. to hide our sexuality, to apologize for our desires, to pretend that physical love is somehow separate from spiritual love. But that's the lie that keeps us disconnected from ourselves and each other. When you dance naked in the rain, when you make love under the open sky, when you let yourself feel everything your body is capable of feeling, that's when you're most truly alive. Daniel found himself thinking about his own relationship with his body, how he had learned to ignore its needs and desires, how he had never experienced the kind of uninhibited physical joy that Starlight embodied. "I don't think I know how to be that free," he admitted, his voice barely audible above the distant music. Starlight moved closer to him, her presence warm and comforting. "Freedom isn't something you know how to do, honey. It's something you choose to be." As the sun began to set on their second day together, Starlight and Daniel found themselves alone for the first time since they had met. The rest of her traveling companions had gone to see Janis Joplin's performance, but Starlight had chosen to stay behind, saying she wanted to spend time getting to know Daniel without the distraction of the crowd. They sat beside a small stream that ran along the edge of the festival grounds, sharing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and fruit that someone had given them earlier in the day. The intimacy of the moment, just the two of them, the sound of running water, the golden light of the setting sun, felt more intense to Daniel than anything he had ever experienced. "Can I ask you something?" Starlight said, her voice unusually serious. "When you were photographing me yesterday, when I was dancing, what did you feel? Not what you thought, but what you felt in your body." Daniel considered the question carefully, trying to remember the physical sensations he had experienced while watching her dance. "I felt like I was witnessing something sacred," he said slowly. "Like I was seeing what a human being looks like when they're completely connected to their own divinity. I felt honored to be able to capture that moment, but I also felt jealous, I guess. Jealous of your freedom, your ability to express yourself so completely without fear or shame." Starlight nodded, as if his answer confirmed something she had suspected. "And what did you feel in your body, Daniel? Not in your mind, but in your chest, your stomach, your groin?" The directness of her question made Daniel blush, but he forced himself to answer honestly. "I felt aroused," he admitted. "But not in a crude way. It was like watching you dance awakened something in me that I didn't even know existed. Something that connected sexuality with spirituality, desire with reverence." Starlight's smile was radiant as she reached out to touch his face gently. "That's exactly what I hoped you would say," she whispered, "because what you felt is what I was trying to express. The connection between the sacred and the sensual, between worship and desire, between the divine and the erotic. Most people have been taught that those things are separate, even contradictory, but they're not. They're the same energy expressing itself in different ways." As she spoke, Starlight began to lean closer to Daniel, her painted face illuminated by the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. "I've been thinking about you since yesterday, about the way you looked at me, about the gentleness in your eyes even when you were capturing something so wild and free. I want to share that energy with you, Daniel. I want to show you what it feels like to be completely present in your body, completely connected to another human being." The kiss that followed was unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced. Where his previous romantic encounters had been tentative, apologetic, rushed affairs marked by anxiety and self-consciousness, this kiss was a revelation of presence and passion. Starlight kissed him as if she had all the time in the world, as if his mouth was the most fascinating landscape she had ever explored, as if the act of kissing was itself a form of meditation. Daniel felt his entire body come alive in ways he had never imagined possible. Every nerve ending seemed to awaken, every breath became conscious and deliberate, every heartbeat connected him more deeply to the woman in his arms. "This is what it feels like to be alive," Starlight whispered against his lips. "This is what it feels like to be free." And for the first time in his 22 years, Daniel understood exactly what she meant. The evening that followed changed Daniel's understanding of what intimacy could be. Starlight made love to him with the same uninhibited joy she brought to everything else in her life, teaching him that sexuality could be playful and sacred simultaneously, that pleasure was not something to be pursued desperately, but something to be received gratefully. She showed him how to be present in his body, how to express desire without shame, how to give and receive pleasure as acts of worship. "Your body is not your enemy," she whispered as they lay entwined beneath the stars. Your desires are not something to be ashamed of. You're a beautiful, sensual, divine being having a human experience. The more fully you can inhabit your humanity, the more connected you become to your divinity. Daniel had never heard anyone speak about sexuality in such sacred terms, and he found himself crying again, overwhelmed by the beauty of what he was discovering about himself. As Janis Joplin's voice echoed across the festival grounds in the distance, Daniel realized that he was falling in love not just with Starlight, but with an entirely new way of being in the world. The shy, repressed photographer who had arrived at Woodstock 3 days earlier felt like a character from someone else's story. In his place was emerging a man who could feel deeply, love freely, and express himself authentically. "What happens when the festival ends?" he asked Starlight, as they lay watching the stars appear one by one in the clear night sky. "What happens to us?" Starlight was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I don't know, sweet Daniel," she said honestly. "I live in the present moment, remember? I don't make plans or promises about the future because the future doesn't exist. All we have is right now, this moment, this breath, this heartbeat. Are you willing to live in this moment with me without needing to know what comes next?" The final day of Woodstock arrived with Jimi Hendrix's legendary dawn performance of The Star-Spangled Banner, a psychedelic interpretation that perfectly captured both the patriotism and the protest that defined the generation. Daniel had been awake all night, holding Starlight in his arms as they talked about art, consciousness, love, and the future of humanity. As Hendrix's guitar wailed across the festival grounds, Daniel realized that he was witnessing the end of something extraordinary. Not just the festival, but his old way of being in the world. The question that had haunted him since arriving at Woodstock was becoming increasingly urgent. What would happen when this magical interlude ended and real life demanded his return? Starlight had awakened something in him that felt too precious to lose, too authentic to abandon, too alive to sacrifice for the security of his former existence. But she had also been clear that she lived without plans, without commitments, without promises about tomorrow. The festival grounds were beginning to show signs of the massive exodus that would soon follow. People were packing up their belongings, exchanging contact information, making plans to reconnect in other cities and at other festivals. Daniel watched the process with growing anxiety, realizing that he had no framework for understanding how to maintain the connection he had found with Starlight in the context of ordinary life. She lived in a converted school bus with a group of traveling artists, following music and inspiration wherever they led. He had an apartment lease in Manhattan, a job at a photography studio, a life built around routine and predictability. The two worlds seemed completely incompatible, and Daniel felt torn between the security of his old life and the authentic aliveness he had discovered in these few precious days. "You're thinking too hard again," Starlight observed, watching his face as they sat together sharing a breakfast of leftover festival food. "I can see the wheels turning, planning and analyzing and trying to figure out how to make this work in your regular world." Daniel nodded, unable to deny the accuracy of her observation. "I don't want to lose this," he said, gesturing between them and toward the festival grounds that had become their temporary paradise. "I don't want to lose you, and I don't want to lose the person I've become here, but I don't know how to integrate this experience with the life I have to return to." Starlight took his hands in hers, her touch grounding him in the present moment. "What if you didn't have to return to that life?" she asked gently. "What if you chose to create a completely different kind of existence?" The suggestion was both thrilling and terrifying. Daniel had never considered the possibility of abandoning his conventional path to pursue the kind of nomadic, artistic lifestyle that Starlight embodied. "I don't know if I'm brave enough for that," he admitted. "You were born into this world of freedom and creativity. I was raised to value security, stability, predictability. I don't know if I can learn to live without those things." Starlight smiled, the same radiant expression that had first captured his attention when she was dancing naked in the rain. "Honey, you don't need to become someone different. You just need to become more fully yourself. The person you've been here with me, that's not a role you've been playing. That's who you really are underneath all the conditioning and fear." Her words rang true, in a way that made Daniel's chest tighten with emotion. He had felt more himself in these 3 days than in the previous 22 years of his life. As the morning progressed, Daniel found himself photographing the festival's end with a different eye than he had brought to its beginning. Instead of documenting the event as an outsider, He was capturing the emotions and experiences of someone who had become part of the community. His images showed the tears and laughter of people saying goodbye, the exchange of phone numbers and addresses, the reluctant packing of belongings that had been scattered carelessly across the muddy fields for 4 days. Through his viewfinder, Daniel could see that he wasn't the only person struggling with the transition back to ordinary life. Many of the festival goers looked like they were waking up from a beautiful dream, unsure of how to carry the magic they had experienced back into their regular existence. Starlight's traveling companions were preparing to leave for California, where they planned to spend the rest of the summer following the festival circuit and living in various hippie communes. "You could come with us," she offered, though Daniel could hear in her voice that she wasn't trying to pressure him into a decision. "We've got room in the bus, and there's always work for a good photographer documenting the counterculture movement. You could make a living doing what you love while living the way you want to live." The offer was everything Daniel had been secretly hoping for and everything he was afraid to accept. Traveling across the country with a group of hippie artists, documenting the revolution in consciousness that was spreading across America, building a life around art and love and authentic experience. It sounded like paradise. It also sounded completely irresponsible. The internal battle between Daniel's conditioned need for security and his newly awakened desire for authentic living played out as he watched Starlight and her friends pack their belongings into the colorfully painted school bus that had been their home for the past year. Everything he had been taught about success, responsibility, and adult behavior told him to exchange contact information with Starlight, promise to visit when possible, and return to his structured life in Manhattan. But everything he had learned about himself in the past 3 days told him that returning to his old existence would be a form of spiritual death. "I'm scared," he admitted to Starlight as they stood beside the bus that could become his new home. "I'm scared of giving up everything I've worked for, scared of disappointing my family, scared of failing at this kind of life." Starlight nodded with understanding, her painted face serious but compassionate. "Fear is natural, honey. Change is scary, especially when it means leaving behind everything that's familiar. But let me ask you something. What scares you more? The possibility of failing at a life that makes you feel alive, or the certainty of succeeding at a life that makes you feel dead?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the truth about his pre-Woodstock existence. He had been successful by conventional standards, but he had also been slowly suffocating under the weight of expectations and conformity. The photographer who had arrived at the festival 3 days earlier had been technically competent, but spiritually empty. The man who stood beside the bus now was raw, uncertain, but vibrantly alive. Daniel's decision came not through rational analysis, but through a sudden, overwhelming certainty that rose from somewhere deeper than thought. "I want to come with you," he said, the words emerging with a strength that surprised him. "I want to learn how to live like you live, how to create art that matters, how to be present in my body and my heart the way you've taught me these past few days." Starlight's smile was like sunrise, illuminating her entire face with joy and pride. "Are you sure?" she asked, though her expression suggested she already knew his answer. "Once we drive away from here, there's no going back to who you used to be. You'll be choosing a completely different kind of life." Daniel thought about his apartment, his job, his family's expectations, all the security he would be abandoning. Then he thought about the way he had felt while photographing Starlight's dance, the aliveness he had discovered in her arms, the authentic self he had found beneath years of conditioning and fear. The goodbye process was surprisingly simple. Daniel called his editor from a payphone, explaining that he was pursuing a long-term assignment documenting the counterculture movement and would be traveling for an indefinite period. He called his landlord and arranged to have his belongings shipped to his parents' house. He wrote a letter to his family explaining his decision, knowing they wouldn't understand, but hoping they would eventually forgive him for choosing authenticity over their expectations. The most difficult part was not the practical arrangements, but the psychological shift from being someone who planned every detail of his life to someone who was willing to trust in the unknown. "You're not losing anything real," Starlight assured him as they prepared to leave Bethel behind. "You're just releasing the illusion of security in exchange for the reality of freedom." The months that followed transformed Daniel in ways he could never have imagined. Traveling across the country in the painted school bus, he documented the flowering of the counterculture movement, while simultaneously becoming part of it. His photographs of hippie communes, protest rallies, music festivals, and alternative communities began appearing in underground publications across the nation, establishing him as one of the premier chroniclers of the generation that was choosing love over war, community over competition, authenticity over conformity. But more importantly, he learned to live with the same fearless authenticity that had first attracted him to Starlight. He grew his hair long, traded his conservative clothes for flowing fabrics and handmade jewelry, and discovered that his body was capable of experiencing pleasure and joy in ways he had never imagined. His relationship with Starlight evolved from passionate romance into something deeper and more complex, a partnership built on mutual growth, creative collaboration, and shared commitment to living authentically. They became lovers, friends, artistic collaborators, and spiritual teachers for each other. Starlight continued to challenge Daniel to be more present, more embodied, more willing to express his truth without apology. Daniel helped Starlight channel her intuitive wisdom into more structured creative projects, documenting her dances and teachings in ways that could reach larger audiences. Together, they created a body of work that captured the essence of the hippie movement, the recognition that human beings were capable of living with far more love, creativity, and authentic connection than conventional society allowed. 5 years after Woodstock, Daniel published a book of photographs titled Dancing Naked: Portraits of the Revolution, featuring his images of Starlight and dozens of other individuals who had chosen to live outside mainstream society's constraints. The book became a cultural phenomenon, introducing mainstream America to the depth and beauty of the counterculture movement, while establishing Daniel as one of the decade's most important documentary photographers. By then, he and Starlight had settled in a small artist community in Northern California, where they continued to create, teach, and live according to the principles they had discovered in those transformative days at Bethel. Daniel often reflected on the shy, repressed young man who had hidden behind his camera at Woodstock, amazed by the journey that had led from that first glimpse of Starlight dancing naked in the rain to a life built around authentic expression, creative collaboration, and fearless love. He had learned that the most important photograph a person can take is not with a camera, but with their entire life, capturing each moment fully, embracing each experience completely, and creating an existence that reflects their deepest truth. In choosing to follow Starlight away from Woodstock, Daniel had discovered not just love, but the courage to become who he was always meant to be.